my name is Maureen Duffy. I'm an interaction designer with Red Hat, and I'm here today to do a little screencast to answer a question that I get pretty frequently from folks who are interested in getting into free software and graphics. And that question is, what is the difference between Inkscape and Gimp? Why would I want to use Inkscape? So let me explain this to you. I'm going to open up Inkscape. And really, the main difference is that Inkscape is a vector graphics editor, and Gimp is a bitmap graphics editor. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Well, if I go here into Inkscape, and I'm going to zoom in on my canvas, I'm going to draw a star, and I'm going to draw a circle, and I'm going to draw a square, okay? Now, Inkscape actually doesn't think of these as bits on a screen. It actually knows that, this is a star object, and this is a circle object, and this is a square object. And it actually lets you manipulate them in ways that are uniquely appropriate to that type of object. So for example, if I take the rectangle square tool in Inkscape, and I click on the square that I drew, if you look up here, kind of under the file menu bar, you're going to see there's an RX and an RY property. And if I change it up here in the toolbar, or if I drag here on the special handle on the square, you can see that I can actually round out the corners of the square. And this is a special property that Inkscape provides to squares. Here now, if I click on the circle tool, you'll see that the toolbar changed again. And these are properties that are specific to a circle. So for example, I can take this little circular handle and start dragging, and I can make a pie chart style version of my circle, or I can actually shear my circle too, depending on what I want to do. And this toolbar will let me switch between the two. And then I can also refill in the circle. Now with the star, I can actually change the number of corners that the star has. I can convert it from a star to a polygon, so it's kind of like and I can also round out the edges. And actually you can do some really cool things with the star tool if you keep hitting rounded. And I can also actually randomize it too and make it kind of funky. But yeah, I mean, these are tools that are specific to a star. So alright, what does this have to do with the difference between Inkscape and Gimp? Well, the thing about it is that I'm clicking on this star, and just with a mouse click I can add more points to it. Now, I'm going to move this into Gimp, but the problem is that I'm going to be moving it into Gimp as a bitmap, because Gimp is a bitmap editor. So here I go. I'm going to minimize Inkscape, and I'm going to open up Gimp. And then I'm going to open up my file. So the first thing you see is that I'm clicking on these, and there's a circular select, and there's like a rectangular select tool, but there's no actual star, polygon, circle, and square tool in Gimp. That's because it doesn't think of them as stars and circles and squares. It thinks of bitmaps as a bitmap. It's literally a map of bits, and each bit has a different color, and that's about it. So for example, I'm gonna give this a white background so you can see a little bit better. I'm just going to make that a layer behind. But now you see, these look pretty smooth and sharp, but as I keep zooming in, and I keep zooming in, and I keep zooming in, you see they're getting fuzzy at the edges, and if I keep zooming in further and further, it's a bitmap. It's a map of bits. These are little squares, or bits, and they're colored in different colors. And what happens is when Inkscape converted that star shape to a bitmap, it added what's called anti-aliasing to the edges of the shape, so that when it was converted to a bitmap and you were zoomed at 100%, it wouldn't look fuzzy, but it won't hold for any sizing of the the bitmap so you can see it's fuzzy. It's like, you know, what happens when, say, you take a photo with your digital camera and maybe an object in the photo was too small in the picture and you tried to crop it down and blow it up and you notice it didn't really look so good. Or maybe if you try to get a photo that, you know, maybe the resolution was high enough for a 4:6, but you tried to print it out 8.5:11, and it gets this kind of look to it. And that's because it's a bitmap. There's only so much data there. If you want a really high resolution poster size photo of something, you're going to need a camera with a really high resolution processor in it. I know that's the wrong word, the CCD, I think. You know, to capture all those pixels. And the reason that, you know, little small cameras can't print out photos that large is because the little processors within them can only store so many bits for the bitmap. So the more expensive the camera, the higher the resolution, the more bits it can hold in the bitmaps that it saves out, then the larger you can print it out and not have this little square problem. So that's kind of what a bitmap is, and that's kind of the difference between a vector and a bitmap. So if I go back into Inkscape, you'll see if I keep zooming in and I keep zooming in and I keep zooming in and I keep zooming in, those little square jaggies never show up. Why is that? Because Inkscape stores the star as a star, the circle as a circle, and the square as a square. And you know, there's different ways it does this. When it stores the star as a star object, it actually stores these 2 points, and this point demonstrates what's the inner point, and then it repeats it the number of corners that star has, and this star stores the outer point, and then it repeats that the number of corners it has. And it also stores the X and Y position on the canvas. And so it really only needs to store those 2 points and just some very simple properties of the star. I think that actually if we go into the XML editor here, I believe this is the star. Yep, so it's type star. It has 10 sides. R1 is the inner point, R2 is the outer point. CX and CY, those are probably the spoke ratio. Or actually, R1 and R2 are probably the spoke ratio and how rounded it is. And then CX and CY are probably the inner point and the outer point. So it's just storing these arguments about the object. That's all the storage it needs for that object to draw it on the screen. So as I redraw this star, if I want to blow it up and make it bigger, it's the same amount of information. It just changes some of the numbers a little bit, and that's really it. If I did the same thing to this star in Gimp, it would need 4 times the number of bits in a bitmap. So it would be 4 times the size, pretty much. I mean, you know, roughly speaking. And that kind of brings me on to another point. There's actually a big advantage to using SVG or other vector formats over bitmap because they take up less space on your hard drive. Because again, it's just storing points, it's just storing metadata. So if I save this out as an SVG, and that's an open format for storing vector files, I'm going to save it as shapes.svg, and then I'm going to go into Gimp and save this out. I'm going to save it to my desktop as shapes.png, and PNG is an open bitmap format. So let's compare the file size, okay? So the SVG is 3K and the PNG is 8.4K. So it's roughly 3 times, a little bit less than 3 times the size of the vector. And that's because it's storing more data. I mean, for each star, it has to store an entire bitmap, where Inkscape just has to store a few attributes and then it redraws on the fly. So anyway, I hope that kind of gives you a better sense of the difference between Gimp and Inkscape. And, you know, just to reiterate, this is why Inkscape is really good if you're doing drawings that you might want to resize later, because you draw this beautiful picture, and this happened to me early on learning Photoshop when I was a kid. I would draw this picture and then I would want to make it bigger, and I couldn't make it bigger because it'd get all pixelated. So if you want to do sort of digital painting, Inkscape is maybe a good bet. Inkscape is great for things that you might have to print out large size, like a logo design or a poster design or a flyer, things like that. Inkscape is really good, and it's really good for working with type. GIMP is great for working with bitmap files. You know, you don't always have the option of doing something in vector. Maybe somebody gave you a bitmap and you can't convert it to vector. And it's also great for working with photos. It's also good that if you want to make a drawing, you can draw it in Inkscape, export it to a bitmap format, then bring it into GIMP and use raster filtering on top of your image. So GIMP can do all sorts of neat tricks, but it does them because a file is bitmap. So you can convert between the two and kind of get the best of both worlds too. Anyway, I hope now you understand when and why you'd want to use one or the other, GIMP or Inkscape.